When I first picked up Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I was not expecting a book that would challenge the way I think about money, work, and life so deeply. I thought it would simply be another motivational book about getting rich. Instead, it felt like a conversation that questioned everything I had learned growing up about education, job security, and financial success. In this book, I speak as myself, sharing what I understood, what surprised me, and how the ideas changed my mindset. The book is written by Robert Kiyosaki and is based on his experience growing up with two father figures, his own biological father, whom he calls his poor dad, and the father of his best friend, whom he calls his rich dad. What immediately caught my attention is that poor and rich do not only describe how much money these men had, they represent two very different ways of thinking. Poor Dad was highly educated, had a stable job, and believed strongly in the traditional path. Study hard, get good grades, find a secure job, and work your way up. Rich Dad, on the other hand, did not finish school but understood money, business, and investments in a way that most people never learn. As I read the book, I realized that I had been raised with many of the same beliefs as Poor Dad. I believed that a good education automatically leads to financial security. I believed that working hard and being loyal to a company would protect me. I believed that money problems could be solved by earning more salary. Kiyosaki challenges all of these beliefs from the very beginning, and that is what makes the book powerful and sometimes uncomfortable. One of the first big lessons I learned is that most people are not taught how money really works. At school, we learn math, history, and science, but we do not learn how to manage money, how to invest, or how to build assets. Poor Dad believed that education was the most important thing in life, and while education is valuable, Rich Dad believed that financial education is just as important, if not more. This idea made me reflect on my own schooling and realize how unprepared many of us are when it comes to real-life finances. Another important concept introduced early in the book is the difference between working for money and having money work for you. Poor Dad taught that working hard for money is the only safe path. Rich Dad taught that if you only work for money, you will always be trapped in a cycle. Work, earn, pay bills, and repeat. As I thought about my own life, I could clearly see this cycle. No matter how much people earn, their expenses often grow with their income. This is what Kiyosaki later calls the rat race. The idea of the rat race deeply resonated with me. It describes how people spend their entire lives working harder and harder, hoping for a promotion or a raise, but never truly becoming financially free. Fear and desire control their decisions. Fear of not paying bills and desire for comfort or luxury. I realized that many of my own financial decisions were driven by these same emotions. I wanted security and I wanted comfort, but I had never stopped to ask whether my choices were actually leading me to freedom. In this first part of the book, Rich Dad emphasized mindset over money. He teaches that how you think is more important than how much you earn. This was a big shift for me. I used to believe that financial success was mostly about opportunity or luck. The book made me see that it is also about learning, discipline, and the willingness to think differently from the majority. Rich Dad often says things like, "The poor and the middle class work for money. The rich have money work for them." This sentence stayed in my mind long after I finished the chapter. What I also appreciated is the storytelling style. The book does not feel like a textbook. It feels like listening to someone sharing life lessons through real experiences. Kiyosaki describes his confusion as a child, trying to understand why his two dads gave him completely opposite advice. This made the lessons easier to understand and more relatable. I could see myself in his questions and doubts. By the end of this first section, I felt that the book was not telling me what to do yet, but it was preparing my mind. It was asking me to unlearn certain beliefs and to become aware of how society programs us to think about money. For me, this awareness was the first step toward change. I began to understand that financial freedom does not start with money in the bank, but with knowledge and a new way of thinking. This is why Part 1 of Rich Dad, Poor Dad is so important to me. It sets the foundation for everything that comes later. It made me question my assumptions, reflect on my habits, and become curious about learning more. In the next part, I will talk about one of the most famous lessons in the book, the true difference between assets and liabilities, and how this single concept can completely change the way we manage our money. Part 2. Assets versus Liabilities. The lesson that changed how I see money. In this part of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the book moves from mindset into one of the most important and practical lessons, the real difference between assets and liabilities. This lesson was a turning point for me because I realized that many people, including myself, use these words incorrectly without understanding their true meaning. Before reading this book, I believed that assets were things like a big house, a nice car, or expensive possessions. That is what society teaches us. If you own these things, people say you are successful. But Rich Dad explains something very simple and very powerful. An asset is anything that puts money into your pocket, and a liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. This definition sounds easy, but when I applied it to real life, it completely changed my perspective. Rich Dad explains that many things people call assets are actually liabilities. For example, a personal house can be a liability if it costs you mortgage payments, taxes, maintenance, and repairs every month without generating income. The same applies to cars, especially luxury cars. They may look impressive, but they lose value over time and constantly cost money. When I reflected on this, I understood why so many people earn good salaries yet still struggle financially. Poor Dad believed that owning a house was always a good investment and a sign of success. He believed that working hard, getting raises, and buying better things was the natural reward for effort. Rich Dad did not reject comfort or owning nice things, but he believed in buying assets first. His philosophy was simple. Build assets that generate income, and then use that income to pay for liabilities. As I read this, I started to look at money more logically and less emotionally. I asked myself a new question before thinking about buying something. Does this put money in my pocket, or does it take money out? This question alone can protect people from many bad financial decisions. I realized that I had often made choices based on emotions, social pressure, or the desire to look successful, rather than long-term financial benefit. Rich Dad encourages the reader to focus on acquiring income-generating assets. These can include businesses, rental properties, stocks that pay dividends, bonds, or intellectual property. The exact type of asset is less important than the habit of investing in things that create cash flow. What matters is building a strong financial foundation instead of relying only on a salary. Another important idea in this section is that your profession does not necessarily define your wealth. You can be a doctor, engineer, or manager and still be financially insecure if you rely only on your job income. At the same time, someone with a modest salary can become wealthy if they consistently build assets over time. This idea was very freeing for me because it showed that financial success is not limited to a specific career path. The book also highlights why financial education is essential. Without understanding assets and liabilities, people unknowingly work hard to buy liabilities, thinking they are moving forward. while in reality, they are increasing their financial stress. This explains why many people feel trapped even after years of working. They earn more, but they also spend more, and their liabilities grow faster than their assets. What I found powerful is that Rich Dad does not criticize people for their choices. Instead, he explains that most people were simply never taught how money works. They follow what they see around them, go to school, get a job, buy a house, buy a car, and repeat. The problem is not effort, but lack of financial knowledge. By the end of this part, I clearly understood why Rich Dad repeats one main rule. The rich buy assets first, and the poor and middle class buy liabilities they think are assets. This rule became like a filter through which I started to see my financial life. It made me more patient and more intentional with money. Part 2 taught me that wealth is not about how much money you make, but about how much money you keep and how hard that money works for you. It showed me that small, consistent decisions can lead to big changes over time. In the next part, I will talk about another major lesson from the book: why being financially intelligent is more important than being academically intelligent, and how fear and emotions control most people's financial lives. Part 3: Financial Intelligence, Fear, and Emotional Control. In the third part of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the focus moves deeper into human behavior. This section helped me understand that money problems are not only about income or knowledge, but also about emotions. Rich Dad explains that fear and desire control most people's financial decisions, and this idea made me reflect honestly on my own life. Fear is one of the strongest emotions when it comes to money. Fear of not paying bills, fear of losing a job, fear of failure, and fear of taking risks. Poor Dad believed that the best way to reduce fear was to find a secure job with a stable paycheck. He believed that safety comes from employment and benefits. Rich Dad, however, believed that relying on a job actually increases fear, because your security depends on something you do not fully control. As I read this, I realized how often fear had guided my choices. Many people accept jobs they do not like, stay in situations that make them unhappy, and avoid new opportunities simply because they are afraid of losing income. Rich Dad explains that fear is natural, but the problem is when we let fear control our lives instead of learning from it. The second powerful emotion discussed in this part is desire, especially the desire for comfort and luxury. People work harder to earn more money, and when they earn more, they spend more. They buy bigger houses, newer cars, and expensive things to reward themselves. At first, this feels good, but soon the pressure increases. More bills, more stress, and more dependency on a paycheck. This emotional cycle keeps people trapped in the rat race. Rich Dad teaches that financially intelligent people learn to manage their emotions instead of reacting to them. They do not immediately spend money when they earn more. Instead, they ask questions, analyze situations, and think long-term. This idea was very important to me because it showed that discipline is not about punishment, but about freedom. Another key lesson in this section is the concept of financial intelligence. Rich Dad defines financial intelligence as the ability to solve financial problems and see opportunities where others see risk. It is not about being a genius or having advanced degrees. It is about learning continuously and being open to making mistakes. The book explains that many people avoid investing or starting businesses because they are afraid of losing money. But Rich Dad believes that mistakes are part of learning. He encourages people to start small, learn from experience, and improve over time. This changed how I think about failure. Instead of seeing it as something to avoid, I started to see it as a teacher. Rich Dad also emphasizes that money magnifies who you are. If you lack discipline, money will make that worse. If you lack knowledge, money will disappear faster. This lesson reminded me that personal growth and financial growth go hand in hand. You cannot separate the two. One of the most practical lessons I learned here is the importance of controlling expenses. Rich Dad explains that when people get a raise, they often increase their lifestyle instead of increasing their assets. Financially intelligent people do the opposite. They increase their assets first and allow their lifestyle to grow later when their assets can support it. This part of the book made me more aware of my habits and reactions. I started to notice when fear was influencing my decisions and when desire was pushing me to spend unnecessarily. Awareness does not change everything overnight, but it is the first step toward control. By the end of part 3, I understood that financial freedom requires emotional strength as much as financial knowledge. Learning how to stay calm, patient, and disciplined is essential. In the next part, I will talk about one of the most practical sections of the book, the importance of learning skills, building businesses, and focusing on cash flow rather than titles or salaries. Part 4. Skills, Businesses, and the Power of Cash Flow. In this part of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I learned that financial freedom is not built only by saving money, but by developing skills. Rich Dad strongly believes that what you know and what you can do are more important than how much you earn at your job. This idea changed how I look at work and career growth. Poor Dad believed that specialization was the key to success. He encouraged focusing on one profession, becoming very good at it, and relying on promotions and salary increases. Rich Dad, however, believed in learning multiple skills, especially skills related to business, sales, investing, and leadership. He taught that the more skills you have, the more opportunities you can create for yourself. One lesson that stood out to me is that many people work for money, but financially free people work to learn. Rich Dad encouraged learning even if the pay is low at first, as long as the job teaches valuable skills. This made me rethink the idea that a job's value is only measured by salary. Sometimes the experience and knowledge gained are worth much more in the long term. This part of the book also emphasizes the importance of building or owning businesses. Rich Dad explains that employees and self-employed people work inside a system, while business owners build systems that work for them. A successful business can generate income even when the owner is not actively working every day. This concept helped me understand why business ownership is such a powerful tool for financial independence. Another key concept here is cash flow. Rich Dad teaches that smart people focus on how money moves, not just how much they earn. Cash flow from businesses and investments can support your life, while salaries stop when you stop working. This lesson made me realize that true security comes from income streams, not from job titles. By the end of part 4, I understood that learning never stops on the path to financial freedom. Developing skills, thinking like an owner, and focusing on cash flow are essential steps. This part prepared me for the final lesson of the book, where Rich Dad explains why taking action and starting, even imperfectly, is better than waiting forever for the perfect moment. Part 5. Taking action and choosing a different path. In the final part of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the main message becomes very clear to me. Knowing is not enough. Action is everything. Many people read books, attend seminars, and talk about money, but very few actually take steps to change their financial lives. Rich Dad explains that the difference between those who succeed and those who don't is the willingness to act despite fear. One of the biggest reasons people do nothing is fear of making mistakes, fear of losing money, fear of being judged, or fear of failing. Rich Dad teaches that mistakes are part of the process. Financially successful people are not people who never fail, but people who learn faster from their failures. This idea helped me understand that waiting for the perfect moment often means never starting. Another important lesson in this part is the power of choice. Rich Dad says that everyone has choices, but not everyone realizes it. Many people say, "I can't afford it," and close their minds. Rich Dad encourages asking, "How can I afford it?" This small change in thinking opens the door to creativity and problem solving. This section also talks about confidence and self-belief. Rich Dad believes that confidence grows with action. The more you learn and try, the stronger you become. Staying still may feel safe, but it often leads to regret. I realized that taking small steps is better than staying stuck in fear. By the end of the book, I understood that Rich Dad, Poor Dad is not just about money. It is about responsibility, mindset, and courage. Financial freedom is a journey that requires learning, patience, and action. This final part reminded me that change begins the moment I decide to think differently and take responsibility for my financial future. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content.